The ICF Training and Technical Assistance Team is honored to welcome you to this California Housing Community Development Community Workshop offered through the Emergency Solutions Grant Coronavirus Relief Consulting and Staffing Services Contract. I'm Chris Pitcher from ICF, and I will be hosting today's session. Today's training session is the final part of our new and non-traditional training series entitled Rent Reasonableness Policy Clinic. It is my pleasure to hand it to our first presenter, Michael Thomas. Mike.
Thank you, Chris. Yes, I am Mike Thomas. I use he, him pronouns. I'm a lead homeless services specialist with ICF, and I will be co-presenting today with my colleague, Gordon. If you'd like to introduce yourself really quickly, Gordon. And we might have lost Gordon. I believe he was having some internet difficulties. What do you think? Should I just go ahead and move on? All right. Well, we will jump right in then, and hopefully Gordon will be able to rejoin us soon. So today we are talking about rent reasonableness, and specifically we are going to do a deeper dive both into what rent reasonableness is and into the California HCD policy. And while we're still on the title slide, it looks like Gordon was able to rejoin us. Perfect. Do you want to introduce yourself really quickly?
Oh, sure. Good morning still in California, everybody. I'm Gordon Lyon. My pronouns are he and him. I am white and Jewish, and I am having internet issues. So if I drop out unexpectedly, please do forgive me. I'm trying to be here with you all, I promise.
Thank you very much, Gordon. All right, so we will jump right in, and I will be happy to cover if your internet gives out again. So this is kind of our order that we will go in today. We're going to do an overview of rent reasonableness. We are going to talk about the California HCD Rent Reasonableness Policy and Worksheet for ESG. We'll talk about calculating rent reasonableness. Then we will have our lightning round that everyone knows and loves. And finally, question and answer at the end. And we should have plenty of time for that. So be sure to come up with your questions as we go through this presentation. So rent reasonableness. What is it? So HUD's rent reasonableness standard is designed to ensure that rents being paid are reasonable in relation to rents being charged for comparable unassisted units. So you're trying to determine if the rent you're paying on the unit that you're assisting matches up with the market for unassisted units in that area. The goal there is to ensure that the unit supported with grant funds is not more expensive than a similar unit that is not supported by grant funds. So again, trying to make sure that you're consistent with the market within which you're working. Recipients, and I will specify that when we say recipient here, we are generally going to be talking about California HCD as the ESG recipient. Entities that receive funding from them are subrecipients, and entities that receive funding further passed down from subrecipients are sub-subrecipients. So that's kind of the order we're talking about here. The recipient is California HCD. The recipient has to determine what documentation is required to ensure that rent reasonableness standards are met. And the recipient must establish their own written policies and procedures for documenting comparable rents and ensure that they are followed when documenting rent reasonableness in case files. As I mentioned, California HCD does have a policy for this, which we will be going through in the presentation. So ESG recipients and subrecipients have to establish standards for rent reasonableness. And then subrecipients and sub-subrecipients are going to determine whether units meet rent reasonableness standards. Where the responsibility lies here is really determined by what entity is directly delivering the rental assistance services to clients. So, California HCD has its policy. Subrecipients have to have policies that are in line with that. If the subrecipient delivers direct services, then they also are going to be responsible for documenting that they are compliant with rent reasonableness in case files. If they further pass funding along and they don't deliver direct services, then that documentation responsibility is generally going to fall with the sub-subrecipient. So the policy is kind of made at the top level. And then when you get down to the direct service provider, that is where the documentation responsibility lies. Rent reasonableness is calculated using local, comparable, unsubsidized units. So it's not a fixed value, and it will vary between units and from place to place. So that's something to keep in mind there. We're going to mention fair market rent on the, or you see fair market rent here. So that's a fixed value. Rent reasonableness is not a fixed value. You determine it based on the local market. It is more complex than fair market rent, but there are ways that you can simplify how you deal with rent reasonableness. And that can be done at the recipient level and at the subrecipient level. So we're going to talk more about that as we go through the presentation. Just be aware rent reasonableness is more complex than fair market rent, but we're going to talk about how you can make it easier. And then finally on this slide, gross rent, and we'll talk about how to calculate gross rent. Gross rent cannot exceed the rent reasonableness standard established by the recipient or subrecipient's policy. So you're going to determine what reasonable rent is in a given area, and then the gross rent for a unit cannot exceed that in order to comply with the ESG regulation. A lot of, excuse me, a lot of this material is drawn from a particular document on the HUD Exchange. If any of my colleagues have the slides and want to drop that in the chat, please do. If not, I have it here and I can do that at when I am not speaking, but we'll drop that so you can see where we sourced a lot of this material from. So I mentioned fair market rent on the previous slide. So this is the difference between rent reasonableness and the fair market rent. Rent reasonableness is determined by the subrecipient, and it's based on written policies and procedures for calculating it. And then it's applied to determine comparable rents for a specific geographic area to determine if a unit is eligible. So again, rent reasonableness won't be the same. It's not a fixed value, and you kind of get to determine the geographic areas that you're looking at for it as well. Fair market rent, on the other hand, that is a number that is calculated by HUD annually. Those usually take effect in October of each year. So HUD usually publishes those, and then in October, that year's fair market rents take effect. And that's applied to ensure a reasonable supply of adequate but modest rental housing is accessible to low-income households. So you're looking at two different standards there. They apply in different ways depending on which type of ESG funding we're talking about, whether it's CV or annual ESG, and there's some other factors in there too that we'll touch on. But just be aware, rent reasonableness and fair market rent are very different. And key there being fair market rent is determined by HUD. So you don't really get to determine how that's calculated. HUD publishes that for you. So what you see here is some differences between ESG CV, ESG, so that's your annual ESG, and then the continuum of care program. So, you know, some of you on this call might deal with COC funds, some might not, but, you know, just so you have an awareness, rent reasonableness and fair market rent apply to these three different funding streams differently. So we're going to point out what some of those differences are here. So under ESG CV, you have to be worried about rent reasonableness if you are dealing with rapid rehousing and homelessness prevention, and specifically with rental assistance under those two components. If you are dealing with annual ESG, then you are in the same boat. If you are delivering rapid rehousing and or homelessness prevention services and you're providing rental assistance under those, then rent reasonableness applies. COC recipients have to think about it in a variety of places, including permanent supportive housing, rapid rehousing, transitional housing, and we'll talk. I'll show you below, you know, kind of an overview of what that looks like for the COC. So rent reasonableness, if you're an ESG CV recipient, all of your units with rapid rehousing and homelessness prevention rental assistance must meet the rent reasonableness standard. The same is true for annual ESG. All units receiving that rental assistance must meet the standard. Under the COC program, it's the same thing. All the units really have to meet the rent reasonableness standard if it is under a program that is being funded in a particular way. It's a little more complicated with COC because there's some different line items that you have to deal with in budgets. So we're not going to get in depth on that. Just be aware it is a little different for the COC program. And then when we talk about fair market rent, so that's the one that is determined by HUD. We're not going into super detail on that in this presentation, but for your awareness, ESG CV does not have to comply with fair market rent standards, only rent reasonableness. Annual ESG, under normal circumstances, does have to abide by both rent reasonableness standards and fair market rent standards for every unit receiving rental assistance. There is a possibility for that to be waived by HUD, but I'm not going to go into detail on that process here either. Just be aware that under normal circumstances, without any waivers directly from HUD to the ESG recipient, annual ESG must comply with both rent reasonableness and fair market rent. And then under the COC program, it gets more complicated. And again, I won't go into details, but it sort of depends on which type of funding they are using. So if it's rental assistance funding, only rent reasonableness applies. If they are using leasing funding, then they are subject to both rent reasonableness and fair market rent standards. So again, no need to really go into the differences in detail there, but it is a little more complicated with the COC program. So key concept here, reasonable. When we say rent reasonableness, we've got that operative word, reasonable. What does that mean in this context? So the gross rent for the unit has to be reasonable in relation to comparable unassisted units in the area. I've said that earlier in the presentation. I'm repeating it because I think it does bear repeating. It's a very key part of the rent reasonableness concept. What you're really thinking about here is the unit that you're paying for consistent with the local market for unassisted units. Reasonable should take into consideration unit location, unit quality, size, type, age, amenities, and maintenance and utilities that might be provided by the owner. These things are integrated into the policy that we will talk about a little later in the presentation. But that is, those are the things that HUD says you should take into account when determining if rent is reasonable. Subrecipients determine what reasonable means in their written standards, and there are many ways to assess and arrive at reasonable. So again, that's another thing we've said already, but I'm repeating it because it does bear repeating. Rent reasonableness, it's flexible, and you have some flexibility in how it's determined based on those local standards that have been established. So another key concept here, your written rent reasonableness policies. These should describe how comparable units are identified. They should list which qualities are assessed for to determine comparability. They should establish documentation standards. So what types of files are being kept in your client files to determine, to document that you're meeting these standards. And they should define what makes rent reasonable. So when you're looking at the gross rent for a unit that you want to assist, what would mean reasonable for that unit? So some examples are, you could say that participant rent has to be less than or equal to each comparable unit's rent. So you're looking at your comps and you're just saying, is the unit we want to assist less than or equal to those in price? Another example, the written standards locally could say participant rent is within $50 of the average rent of comparable units. So in that scenario, you're taking a number of comparable units and you're figuring out the average rent. And then you're saying participant unit rents have to be within $50 of that average rent. So it gives you a little more flexibility. California HCD's policy does have some language around how you should be doing this. So we will get to that later in the presentation, but it's just another example of how there is flexibility in how rent reasonableness can be approached as long as your method is sound and it is clearly documented what you are doing to determine rent reasonableness. So these are the requirements by ESG program component. We've touched on this before too, but we want to make it really clear. Street outreach does not have to deal with rent reasonableness. It does not apply to clients being served under street outreach, nor does it apply to clients being served through emergency shelter, nor does it apply to HMIS activities. So those things are not subject to any kind of rent reasonableness standard under ESG. Rapid rehousing is subject to rent reasonableness, and homelessness prevention is subject to rent reasonableness when you are providing rental assistance. We're going to talk about that a little more later too, But that's a key thing to keep in mind. It's when you are providing rental assistance. We will give you some specifics on what those situations look like. So requirements for rapid rehousing and homelessness prevention for rent reasonableness. It is required when providing rental assistance, as I mentioned. If you provide rental assistance and a one-time rental arrears payment, then you have to, your unit is subject to rent reasonableness. If you are providing rental assistance and housing relocation and or stabilization services, then the unit is subject to rent reasonableness standards. So the key there being, in all of those scenarios, you're providing rental assistance, and so the unit is subject to this standard. It is not required if the only assistance you're providing is a one-time rental arrears payment. So if that's the only thing you're providing for that household, the unit does not need to meet the rent reasonableness standard. If you're providing housing relocation and or stabilization services, but you are not providing any rental assistance, then the unit is not subject to rent reasonableness because you're not providing rental assistance there. However, if you do later provide rental assistance, then it does become required. So if you engage with a client and you are providing, say, housing stabilization services, and you're not assessing their unit for rent reasonableness, but then 3 months into that service provision, you determine that they do need rental assistance. At that point, their unit does become subject to rent reasonableness standards, and you would have to assess it to make sure that you can actually make those rental assistance payments based on the rent reasonableness standard. So for certification and recertification timing, you have to certify that applicable units meet the rent reasonableness standard before the initial lease is executed. That's when your initial certification would happen. And then for recertification, that's going to happen before a lease is renewed. So when it's time to renew that lease, you have to reassess and make sure that it meets the standard. If an existing participant moves to a new unit, then before that new lease is executed, you have to make sure that the unit meets the rent reasonableness standard. If your subrecipient's written policy requires it more frequently, then you have to abide by that. So there we're kind of talking about local ESG written standards. If there are local written standards that are more strict than what HUD or California HCD requires, you have to abide by those stricter local standards. So that's always going to be your first layer that you look at. What do your local standards require if you have them? And then there can be certain other triggers. Not going to really go into detail on that here. But, just be aware that if you have a complicated situation, you can always reach out to either your grant administrator if you're on ESG CV, or your annual ESG rep if you are using annual ESG, and they can help walk you through that. There can be complicated situations, but I think the vast majority of them fit into one of the things we've just described, and will be pretty straightforward. And now I'm going to turn it over to Gordon to talk about the policy.
All right, I love talking about the policy. Let's go ahead and get into it. Next slide, if you please. There we go. Okay, so your rent reasonableness policy at the HCD level says the following. Well, that's the federal requirement first. The federal requirement is that at minimum, projects have to consider the location, quality, size, unit type, age of the contract unit, and any amenities, housing, services, maintenance, or utilities to be provided by the owner as part of rent reasonableness. And there's a citation there back to the ESG program interim rule. Your HCD requirements sort of filter that down and add to or expand on the ways in which you think about them in the following ways. For a unit to be comparable, it must have the same number of bedrooms. To be comparable, it must be of the same or a similar unit type, and it divides unit type into single family apartments with 4 or fewer units, apartments with 5 or more units, efficiencies in SROs, townhouses, It must be in the same or a similar census tract or neighborhood. And there are provisions in the policy there for participant units that are in urban areas or areas with significant differences in rent within the census tract. Comparables need to be drawn from the same neighborhood. Neighborhood needs to be defined by the service provider. This is intended to deal with places where, like, block to block or neighborhood to neighborhood, you see big swings in rent. Otherwise, comparable units have to be drawn from the same census tract. There are, again, there's a little bit of wiggle room in the policy about it. I encourage you to have a look at the policy. But generally speaking, that's what you're looking for. Units need to be of comparable quality. Quality is defined as good, fair, or poor. Subrecipients' discretion at what those actually mean on the ground. What is good in one jurisdiction may be very different from what is good in another jurisdiction. Similar amenities, and we're talking about things like off-street parking, in-unit laundry, walkability to schools, access to public transit, that kind of thing. And finally, disability accommodations. All of those are elements you need to take into consideration when you're talking about reasonableness. Next slide, please. So let's talk about rent comparability. When we think about rent reasonableness, at the end of the day, we're ultimately trying to do a mathematical comparison, right? We're taking the rent of the unit that we want to subsidize and saying, is that rent reasonable in relation to other comparable units? The standard for comparability or reasonableness being used under your policy is that the participant's gross rent, unit gross rent, cannot be more than $100 over the average gross rent of 3 comparable units. And that standard can only be waived with HCD's permission. So what that means is you're going to take 3 comparable units, you're going to average their gross rent, and we'll talk about what that means in a moment, and that'll give you a number. And then as long as the participant's unit is not more than $100 over that average, you're good to go. Incidentally, that $100 buffer is intended to take into consideration the reality that rents are a challenge in your service area, and that if you were just taking the average, you might not necessarily be in a position to get every unit that you want to or that ought to be subsidized in under this policy. Gross rent is a lump sum that includes the contract rent plus recurring fees. Recurring fees, a little out of scope for what we're talking about, but it excludes pet fees and the amount owed to the participant based on utilities that are not included in the rent that have to be calculated using the PHA's local PHA's utility allowance schedule. This includes water, sewer, electric. It does not include telephone and internet. And so you have to, the bit about the local PHAs there, what we're talking about when we say calculated using their utility allowance schedule is it's what you're not going to do is take a comparable unit and ask for the last 12 months of their utility bill and say, okay, the average of this is what, electric costs. That's not what you're going to do. What you are going to do is go to your local PHA. They put out on an annual basis a utility allowance schedule that says for a unit of this config type and this number of bedrooms, the electric or the gas or the water and sewer is this much per month. And then you're going to, as part of the gross rent, include the amount for each of those itemized utilities that are not included in the rent. So for a unit that says all utilities included, this is the amount you pay per month, and you're never going to talk to a utility company. The gross rent is just the contract rent. It's whatever the contract says you pay the landlord every month. For units that do not include all utilities, you have to include an amount from that utility allowance schedule for each utility that was not included. And so you'll end up saying the contract rent's $1,000, plus 26 bucks for water and 11 bucks for sewer and 79 for heat and electric, so on and so on and so on, gas and electric. And that's how you arrive at gross rent. We encourage y'all to reuse comparable units across multiple rent reasonableness assessments whenever possible, applicable, and reasonable. The worst thing in the world is running a 100-unit project and having to refine comparable units for every stinking unit. That will take up one entire staff person's life, and they will not enjoy their job. This can be dealt with by having a policy. It says you can keep comparable units and reuse them for a 90-day period after they've been identified. And so this is sometimes referred to as a rent reasonableness binder or a comparable unit database that's maintained either by a specific project or by multiple projects operating in the same area. The upshot is you really want to find units and then reuse them over time, updating them only as they cycle out of that 90-day period. 90 days is a good compromise position between having to find new units all the time and keeping the same units for like an entire year as the market remains volatile. If you have a good cause to request a waiver for any of the things we just talked about, you can do so. Good cause is up to you to argue, and HCD is at its discretion to accept or deny a waiver request. But the archetypically good cause is, imagine that you have a unit that is right at the edge of its census tract. So it's in census tract 1, and it's right on the edge. Census tract 1 has like the toenail of a large city that exists in census tract 2. Census tract 1 is mostly rural. Census tract 2 is all urban. And the unit you've got is in census tract 1, but no one thinks of it in terms of census tracts. It's a suburb of the city in census tract 2. A good reason for a waiver might be this unit realistically is part of that other census tract. We need to be able to pull our comparable units from the city that this unit is actually a part of, regardless of what the census tract boundaries say. That's a good waiver request. So keep in mind that there's flexibility here if and when you need it. I will also note that Mr. Michael Thomas did drop into the chat a copy of your fair market rent and rent reasonableness policy, which recaps all of this in depth and provides you with a little bit more information about your flexibilities. Next slide, please. So if we were in a live presentation setting, or if we were in a classroom, this is where I would become unbearable and ask people to raise their hands and say, have you seen this before? Is this familiar to you? I'm not going to do that because that would be profoundly annoying to do over Zoom for all of us, I think. This is your rent reasonableness and fair market rent certification. It's put out by HCD. There is a link to it. I'm going to go ahead and drop that in the chat for you all right now. Boom. This is a template that you can use to easily capture all of the information in your rent reasonableness policy that wraps up in one nice, neat little package everything you're required to do for fair market rent and rent reasonableness and tells you exactly how you're supposed to do it. I want to emphasize this because apparently this has been identified as a deficit as part of monitoring, and I'm confident nobody on this line is doing this, but I want to make sure that I put it out there for future generations accessing this video to hear. Fill out the entire form. There's a reason there are 4 columns here. There's a column for the participant unit and for 3 comparable units. The policy says you need to compare the participants' units average rent, gross rent, to the average rent of 3 comparable units, not 2 comparable units and not 0 comparable units. Fill out the entire sheet. There's a reason there are 4 columns. This is the top of the sheet. It gives you, there are boxes on the sheet for everything that is in the policy that you are required to consider. This is the top half of the sheet. Next slide, please. And this is the bottom of the sheet. it tells you exactly what you're supposed to do. You are certifying, first of all, you're going to calculate exactly as it says on this page. Participant gross rent is not more than 100% or $100 above the average gross rent of your comparable units. Therefore, it meets the rent reasonableness standard. Couldn't be simpler, plain as milk. Fill it out, and you're going to sign at the bottom. That is the only thing that you have to do to make sure that this actually goes correctly. And if you have a complete, filled out, and accurate rent reasonableness form, along with backup documentation for comparable units in the folder along with this, or in a binder somewhere that you can reference, but I would keep them with the thing, right? It's the easiest way. As long as you've got Craigslist printouts or, whatever, rent.com printouts stapled to the back of this thing that supports the information on the sheet. The sheet is completely filled out. The sheet is accurate. Participant unit gross rent is not more than $100 above the average of comparables. You are golden for rent reasonableness. Next slide, back over to Mr. Michael Thomas.
Thank you very much, Gordon. So we've touched on this. We're going to get into a little more detail on calculating rent reasonableness. So finding comparable units. We've talked a lot about how you need to find these comparable units. That's how you're going to make your comparison. How do you do that? So here's some rental housing data sources that you might consider. There's a lot of public sources out there. So you're thinking here about organizations that collect and aggregate data on local rental housing stock. That can include public housing agencies. It can include like a local chamber of commerce. Sometimes there's renters associations with public data out there. So anything along those lines, that can be a good data source for finding comparable units. Real estate advertisements are also a good source in a lot of markets. This can be ads in newspapers, it can be ads online, it can be any other printed publication where rental units are advertised. You can, identify things like for rent signs that you see in the neighborhoods where you work. You can assess those units to figure out the cost for them and use them for rent reasonableness. Bulletin boards and community locations. If you have real estate agents that work with you, I've worked with nonprofits that had people from the real estate industry on their board. So that's something to consider if you have that type of resource. Property management companies, rental listing websites like Zillow and things like that. All of these can be good sources of information for identifying those units. Some areas have rental market studies that have been done, and there's the possibility to do rental market studies. I will note this is an in-depth thing. So it's not right for every area, but it is a possibility. It's an in-depth analysis of a particular rental market, and it's prepared for specific communities. But you have to be aware of narrowly focused housing types in these studies. So it is not uncommon to see a rental market study that is done for, the example you see here is like senior housing. So if the study was done specifically for senior housing, and that is not the entirety of the population that you are housing with your ESG program, then those units aren't going to be comparable. So just bear that in mind if you're looking at rental market studies. Rental market survey. So that's a comparison of various landlords and property management companies in the area produced by local associations of rental owners and managers. The drawback here is that the sources sometimes do not include amenities in the comparison. So if you are looking at that type of rental market survey, just be sure that you dig into it and determine what they included when they figured out the rental amounts, because if it doesn't include the amenities, then the units probably aren't going to be comparable compared to a gross rent that you're going to be calculating for your unit. And then finally, rental database. So a database or binder that is created by the grantee that includes comps for frequently administered housing types within a set jurisdiction. So we mentioned that earlier. When we say a binder, we're really talking about, like, if you have, say that you're working in one county and you have 4 neighborhoods that people are typically housed in, you can do an assessment for each of those neighborhoods of what comparable units are for a 1-bedroom, for a 2-bedroom, for a 3-bedroom, or whatever it is you typically are providing in terms of size with your units. And then you can just maintain those comparables, and as Gordon mentioned, you just reassess it every 90 days to make sure that those comparables are still going at the same market rate that you originally assessed them at. And when they aren't, then you just redo it. You recalculate it based on the current situation. But you can maintain that and just reuse it over and over. And I advocate for that method because it makes things very easy. And if you're keeping up with your paperwork well enough, you can actually just fill out one of those sheets that Gordon showed you with the 4 columns. You can have your 3 comparable unit columns filled out and in your binder. And your case manager could say, just make a copy of that and then fill out the column with the unit that they are assessing for a client, make the comparison to your comps, and then determine if it's reasonable or not. If you do what I just said, just be very, very aware of the fact that when you reassess your comparables and you find out that they have changed, you have to destroy any copies that currently exist of that you might have made so that you can replace it with the new ones. But if you manage that properly, it can be a really easy and efficient way to get this done and to make life easier for your case managers in terms of documentation. So how do you find comparable units in rural areas? This is something that we run into a lot when we work with communities in rural areas. Comparable units are not as easy to come by in a lot of rural places. So some things to think about there. The U.S. Department of Agriculture's Rural Development Agency has a rural development office, or rural development offices that can provide information on the types of rental housing available in communities throughout the state. So that could be a source if you're in a rural area and you just can't find comparable units to get this done. You can think about reaching out to the rural development office in your area, and they might be able to help you. Public housing authorities, if the rural community happens to be under the jurisdiction of one. So sometimes this will be a statewide PHA. That could be the case in a rural area. But it's a good thing to check. So if you're having trouble with comparable units and you can find that there is a public housing authority serving the area, they will often be able to help you figure out what comparable rents are. And then finally, real estate agents. They can often extrapolate rent estimates based on the general cost of housing in an area. So again, another good resource. If you have access to a good real estate agent and you're having trouble in a rural area, that real estate agent might be able to help you out quite a bit. All right, so calculating the gross rent amount. We went over this a little earlier. Going to go over it again because it is incredibly important. We're not just talking about the number on the contract. We are talking about the total contract rent amount for the unit. So that is the number on the contract, plus any fees required for occupancy under the lease, excluding late fees and pet fees. Those do not count. We're talking about those recurring fees other than pet fees. So like, for instance, it is not uncommon to see an administrative charge included in a lease as part of the monthly payment. If that is the case, then that admin charge is lumped in with the rental amount as part of the gross rent. So it's those recurring fees like that. And then there's the monthly utility allowance. Again, like Gordon said, that includes water, sewer, electricity, gas. It does not include telephone and internet, nor does it include cable or anything like that. We are talking here about using that utility allowance from the Public Housing Authority's utility schedule, unless utilities are included in the rent. So any utilities that are on the rental contract and included with the rental payment do not get any additional treatment here. However, for everything that is not included in the rental contract, you are including the allowance amount from the Public Housing Authority that covers the area. I will note that those tend to be updated annually, but in my experience, the time during the year at which PHAs update their utility allowance schedules tends to vary. So if you have multiple PHAs you're working with, you might not see them all update those at once. I would probably, in that instance, just make it a practice to check it at specific times throughout the year. And then when you notice they've published their new schedule, you can update your records as such. So you add all of that together that we just talked about, and that is the gross rent amount for the unit. And so we just talked through a lot of those things around utilities, which you see at the note or in the note there at the bottom. I'm not going to go through it again. If you have questions about that, though, please feel free to drop them in the chat or hold them for the end, and we will be happy to address them. And I'm going to turn it over to Gordon to walk us through an example.
All right, so we're going to breeze through this example just a little bit. This is a detailed example of how you would think about calculating rent reasonableness in a situation in which you are you've created a rent reasonableness policy in which you were trying to get the participants' gross unit rent less than or equal to the average rent. So you implemented locally a more restrictive policy than the one HCD is currently using. The way that you would think about it is the policy states, of course, that all units must have the same number of bedrooms and be in the same census tract, and that gross rent has to be less than or equal to the gross rent average. The assessment is that all the units are one bedroom and they're all in census tract 24, so they're all comparable from the non-financial end, and the participant's gross rent, which is $900, is greater than the average of the comparable unit's gross rent of $875. The outcome being that this unit does not meet rent reasonableness standards under the more restrictive local policy. Staff ought to sign and date the form they used and include it in the client file as they move on to other units for comparability. Next slide, please. Now, this is a similar example, but this is using HCD's policy in which rent does not exceed $100 above the average gross rent. So same bedroom requirements, same census tract requirements. Again, all the units have the same number of bedrooms. All of them are in the same census tract. The average of comparable rents is $875. The participant's gross rent is $950. However, in this situation, the unit does meet rent reasonableness standards because it is only $75 over the average gross rent. It's within that $100 over allowance. Again, staff should sign, date, and include this form in the client file to demonstrate the rent reasonableness was complete. Next slide, please. So policies and procedures on rent reasonableness. This is HUD's requirement. Recipients and subrecipients have to have written policies and procedures for documenting rent reasonableness. We've talked about those today. You need a methodology for documenting comparable rents. You need case file checklists and forms, standards for certifying comparable rents as reasonable, staffing assignments, and strategies for addressing special circumstances. Those first three bullets are completely addressed by adopting the HCD rent reasonableness template. It is your checklist, it is your form, it is your methodology because it encapsulates the methodology in the HCD policy, and it includes a standard for certification, meaning somebody is signing it. The only two bits of this that you might have at the subrecipient or sub-subrecipient levels without creating a more restrictive policy than HCDs are staffing assignments. So who is responsible for doing these? And that's an interesting question. We don't really have to get into it. I'm not really sure that there is a good way to get into it, but the person doing the rent reasonableness assessment does not need to be the same person who is doing case management, but it can be. It could also be your HMIS data specialist. Those are, if you happen to have like an administrator who sits somewhere between case managers and your program manager, that might be a good fit for them. Where this lands at your organization or in your COC, if you're doing like a multiple project implementation of rent reasonableness, it really depends on what makes sense. But just what I would highlight is that there's no natural place for it to fall. It's wherever it makes sense, and that might just be like who's got the tolerance for it, right? Who's good at this? Who can tolerate this specific kind of work? Who's got an aptitude for it? who's good at finding comparable units, who finds it an enjoyable or at least an okay task to do. Speaking as someone whose job this was for 2 years, it does take a special kind of person, I think, to be able to put up with it long term, as sometimes it's not very interesting work. But it is important. It's important to participants and it's important to the project. So getting it in the hands of somebody who's got a good grip on what's required is a good idea. Finally, a strategy for addressing a special circumstance. This is really like what happens if a unit's on the edge of a census tract type things. And that's not something you necessarily have to have a policy around, but you do want to have your head around like what you do if you need a waiver or something goes sideways. Who do you talk to? Who's responsible for carrying that out? And how do you document it? And where do you document it? And it's better to have that worked out in advance than on the day of. Because if you work it out on the day of, you're just going to do whatever's easiest. If you work it out in advance, it's going to be a thoughtful, integrated solution. The only thing I would add to that is the thing I just said could probably be applied to literally anything in ESG. So as a general rule, good TA advice, if you can possibly plan ahead for it, you probably ought to, especially if it is a predictable circumstance that you may need to address in the future. Next slide, please. So some tips and best practices. Big question, what if you can't find 3 comparable units? Look for recently leased units. They're often, comparable does not mean on the market right now necessarily. I apologize if you can hear a large dog barking in the background. Look for recently leased units. Document the rationale for the price difference between units with different amenities or assets. This is again about building a paper trail of reasonableness. Documenting your rationale for price differences between different neighborhoods. So this is for going outside of your normal neighborhood or direct service area. Consult with your local experts. Mike Thomas talked you through this just a little bit ago in terms of how you can think about where else to find units. And finally, request a waiver from HCD. At the end of the day, if you can't make it work and you need to get somebody housed, this is when you reach out to your grant administrator and say, hey, we need a thing. Here's a letter. This is what we need. Please process this. Next slide, please. Yes, the tickler. Finally, this is kind of what I was getting at last slide, and I'm going to reiterate it again. We have expressed a methodology for doing things that is simple, straightforward, well encapsulated, well defined, that takes a thing that is chaotic, rent reasonableness, and makes it relatively simple and straightforward. And that's going to work most of the time. But you really ought to ensure that your policies and procedures at the subrecipient and at the project level include troubleshooting approaches for what the heck goes wrong if all of a sudden, for example, rent everywhere goes up by $300. What do you do if your current approach no longer works? Who do you talk to? Who do you alert? Who's responsible for figuring it out? And the reason we mention that is rents are volatile and rent reasonableness is by its nature flexible, which means that volatility can cause that flexibility to become a problem. And so having even just a line in your policies and procedures that says such and such a person is responsible for figuring it out when our policy's general approach doesn't work can save you a lot of heartache in the long run. Which I believe takes us into the lightning round. I'm going to go ahead and say next slide and kick it over to Mr. Michael Thomas to ask the first question.
Yeah, sorry about that. You might have seen the answer there, but we're still going to do this. So question number 1. This is a true or false. And this is from the beginning of the presentation. So think back to that very beginning. Is it true or false? ESGCV requires both fair market rent and rent reasonableness standards to be met. Is that true or false? And I believe, I'm not sure if we got the polls set up. So I will ask my supporting staff, please, if we got the polls, then we'll put a poll up for you. And there you have it. So you should see your poll popping up on your screen there. Choose which one you think is the best answer. And I will leave it up to our other fantastic staff who can see what's going on with that poll to determine when a reasonable number of people have responded. Then we'll close it out and we'll show you the answer that I've already accidentally showed you. we have almost an even split. A few more people saying false there. It's pretty close though. All right, what do we think? We ready to close that one out?
Yeah, I think that's it.
All right, thank you very much. So it looks like a slight majority there said false, but we had almost an even split there. So let's see what the correct answer is. The answer there is false. Fair market rent is waived for ESGCV so long as it complies with rent reasonableness. So only rent reasonableness is required for ESGCV. Fair market rent is not. Although note that they are both required for annual ESG in the absence of HUD saying otherwise to the recipient. And over to Gordon for the next one.
On mute. Which of the following is not true? A, that HUD's rent reasonableness standard is designed to ensure that rents being paid are reasonable in relation to rents being charged for comparable assisted units in the same market. B, the goal of rent reasonableness is to ensure that ESG and ESGCV funded units are comparable to market priced units. C, that recipients, meaning HCDs and similar, are responsible for determining what documentation is required to ensure that rent reasonableness standard is met. Or D, that recipients, meaning HCD alikes, must establish their own written policies and procedures for documenting comparable rents and ensure that they are followed when documenting rent reasonableness in the case file. Which of these is not true? We'll give you a little time on this one because it's a little wordy. And as the all-time king of being a little wordy, I know how it be. Got some answers there, looking good. It's a little less than a third of you. Can we get one more response? Yeah, all right, we'll call it good. The bare, more. The bare majority of you, all right, the majority of you, half of you, think the answer is C, that C is the lie. Let's have a look at the answer. I'm sorry to tell you that A is the lie. The untrue statement is that rent reasonableness is designed to ensure that rents being paid are reasonable in relation to rents being charged for comparable assisted units in the same market. This is, of course, a little bit of a trick. Comparability should only be applied to unassisted units in the same market. The reason C is not correct is that recipients are indeed responsible for determining what kind of documentation is required to ensure that rent reasonableness is met, though of course they have the option to pass that standard downstream to subrecipients who can make that same determination. Next slide, please. Over to you, Mike.
All right, question number 3. Which of the following that you see here would be considered a reasonable definition of reasonable? So which of these would be a good definition of reasonable? Choice A is that it should take into consideration unit location, quality, size, type, age, amenities, accommodations, and utilities by the owner. Reasonable should take into consideration unit location. Is that the same thing? Sorry, I think that one I think that's copy and paste error. So A and B are the same thing. Feel free to choose either of those when your poll pops up. Actually, C is the same thing too, isn't it? I apologize for that. D is also the same thing. No, it isn't. Okay, so it can be A, B, or C, or D. What do you think? Should we just? Okay. Yeah, feel free to choose any of the top 3 or D. Which of those do you think is correct? We turn this one into a 2-parter.
So I got you here, Mike. They are actually all different. They have slightly different things inside of them.
Yeah,
So,
sorry. Clearly I did not read this in advance. Not this one.
Yeah. So like A has size, but B does not include size. A swaps out unit location with census tract, etc.
Oh, this is an evil one. This is a really evil one.
I remember I wrote this one. This was genuinely the meanest thing I've ever done on a slide in my entire life.
Yeah, sorry about that.
That's okay. I'm not.
Oh no, you know that I like writing evil questions. I just didn't write this one, and it's so evil that I lost track of it as I was trying to get through it.
That's the level of evil that I like to put out into the world.
All right, well, it looks like we've got a very slight majority choosing option C. Oh, no, never mind. People are still answering. Keep it coming. And we still have answers coming. It looks like we're leaning towards option A by a tiny, tiny sliver. And I think we can go ahead and call that. Option A is what we are saying by a very small amount. And that is the correct answer. Congratulations, everyone. Despite my best efforts to mess that up for you, you still managed to get it right. Good job. Option A is correct. All of the above also appear on the rent reasonableness certification form from HCD. So another plug for that form. It includes all of these things that HUD says you should be looking at. So if you adopt that form, you will be compliant with what HUD says you should be doing. And back to you, Gordon.
All right. This one should be easier. You got a 50-50 shot. True, false. Comparable units must be drawn from the same census tract. True or false? There should be a poll on this one. Oh, the answers are pouring in. Pouring in. Pouring in. We love to see it. You really do. Okay, well, we'll cut it there. 2/3 of you think the answer is true. Put it on the board. Sorry to say that the answer is false. If the participant unit is in an urban area or an area where there are significant differences in rent within the census tract, comps must be drawn from the same neighborhood as defined by the service provider. Otherwise, comparable units must be drawn from the same census tract. The census tract guidance is generally what you see in rural or semi-rural areas. The same neighborhood guidance is what you see in areas that are very urban and see significant differences as you move down a couple of blocks. So a little bit of a trick question there, but well answered those of you who said false. Back over to you, Mr. Michael Thomas.
All right. Number 5. Unless granted a waiver by California HCD, which of the following that you see here is true? So in the absence of a waiver, the participant unit's gross rent cannot be more than the highest price comparable rental unit out of the 3 units that you analyzed as comparable. The participant unit's gross rent must be equal to the middle price unit, so equal to the middle price of the 3 comparable units analyzed. The participant unit's gross rent cannot be more than the average gross rent of the 3 comparable units analyzed, or the participant unit's gross rent cannot be more than $100 greater than the average gross rent of the 3 comparable units analyzed. So you're looking at 4 different standards for making that comparison. You've analyzed 3 units. Which of these is the rent reasonableness standard that is included in California HCD's policy? So it's really just a matter of what you are looking at with those comparable units. Are you looking primarily at the highest priced one? Are you looking at the middle price one? Are you looking at an average of the 3? Or are you looking at an average of the 3 and saying that the participant unit cannot be more than $100 greater than that average? What's your primary comparison? We do see about 60% of you have answered. It looks like option D is a strong favorite there, so we can go ahead and close that one. and take a look at the right answer, which is option D. That is what the California HCD policy says. You are taking your 3 comparable units, you are averaging them, and then you are taking your participant unit and seeing if the gross rent for that unit is not more than $100 greater than the average gross rent of your comparables. Nice job, everyone. We will move on to the next one.
All right. This is an easy one, I hope. Gross rent. Does it equal A, the total contract rent amount of the unit plus the monthly utility allowance? B, total contract rent plus fees required for occupancy, excluding late and pet fees, plus monthly utility allowance? Or C, contract rent plus all occupancy fees under the lease? A, B, or C? And the answers pour in. I love it. Y'all are attentive now. You're hungry for the lightning round. Metaphor doesn't make a lot of sense. Lightning is not food, but I said it, so here we are. All right, well, that looks like pretty much the entire crew. I'm going to go ahead and cut it there. The overwhelming majority of you think the answer is B. Let's have a look. You are, of course, correct. The answer is B. Gross rent is contract rent plus utility allowance plus any fees required for occupancy under the lease, which does not include late fees and pet fees. Well done, 74% of y'all. Next slide, over to you, Mike.
All right. Question 7 is kind of an example. So let's talk through this. Unit A leases for $1,000 a month. Unit B leases for $1,100 a month. Unit C leases for $1,250 a month. All the unit rents include utilities, all of them. So what is the maximum rent that could be charged for a participant unit based on these 3 comparables? You're probably going to need to take out a calculator here. That's a little bit of a hint. So we are asking, based on the California HCD policy, what is the maximum rent that could be charged for a participant unit if these are your 3 comparables? I'm going to be generous with the time on this one because you might need to find your calculator. Or your phone if you have it right in front of you. That would be my go-to. Or you could just ask Siri. Or Alexa, or whichever device is listening to you at the moment.
I was going to say, I usually just ask Mike.
Yeah.
Does this add up, Mike? Is the way I usually go about it.
I will only commit to 30% of my answers to that being made up at any given time. Yeah, it adds up. Sure.
I was going to say, that's what you'll commit to.
All right, we're at about 60% of you, so we can close that one out. Looks like the majority chose option C, which is $1,216.67 a month. Let's see what the correct answer is. And that is the correct answer. That is the right amount. Good job finding your calculators and good job pushing through that one. You got it. That is exactly the correct amount. Well done, everyone. Next slide.
I'm very impressed. Math is not usually a strong suit in homeless services. It's certainly not mine. So well done, y'all. All right, question 8. The subject unit being considered by a client is a 2-bedroom, 2-bath apartment built in 96. There is in-unit laundry and off-street parking. Which of the following is the most viable comparable unit? Which of these is the most viable comparable unit? Unit A, a 2-bedroom, 2-bath subsidized apartment built in 90 with in-unit laundry and off-street parking. Unit B, 2-bedroom, 2-bath, market priced, built in 95 with in-unit laundry and off-street parking. Unit C, 2-bedroom, 2-bath, townhome, built in 90 with on-site laundry and off-street parking. Or Unit D, 2-bedroom, 2-bath, single-family home built in 96 with in-unit laundry and off-street parking. Which of these is the best comparable unit for the unit the participant is considering. Waiting on a poll there. There we go. Beautiful. Oh, people are ready. They were chomping at the bit. Again, not a lightning thing at all. That's a horse thing, but still. Suppose you might find this experience electrifying. That would be lightning related, I guess. Chris's expression very stormy. Mike's clouded over.
I enjoy a good thunderstorm.
Don't, as long as you're not raining on my parade. All right, well, that's about half of y'all, and about half of y'all think the answer is B, so let's go ahead and have a look. You are, of course, correct. The underlining here highlights the relevant data that we were hoping you would pull out of these examples. You are, of course, looking to make sure that it's 2-bedroom, 2-bath, all of them are. Market priced is important. You want it to be a market priced unit, not a subsidized unit. You're looking for an apartment, obviously, because the client's unit is also an apartment. So the townhome and the single family home are not as good a fit. 95 is very close to 96, certainly a lot closer than 1975. And you want to make sure that it's got similar amenities, in-unit laundry and off-street parking, as opposed to, for example, street parking in Unit D. They are not the same. And if you live in a city, you are intimately aware of that fact. Go ahead and take us over to the next question, and Mr. Michael Thomas.
All right. So for this question, recipients and subrecipients must establish written policies and procedures for documenting rent reasonableness, including, so which of these must be included in those written policies and procedures? A methodology for documenting comparable units, case file checklists and forms, standards for certifying comparable rents as reasonable, staffing assignments, strategies for addressing special circumstances, or the magical answer of all of the above. An answer choice which I have been known to weaponize before, but I did not write this question, so you don't have to take that under consideration. You've got your poll up there, so feel free to go ahead and drop your answer in.
Did I write this question?
I'm not sure who wrote this question.
Well, I usually do not put a dash between sub and recipients. I usually put it all together. On the other hand, I do love a good ampersand. It's going to say you're digging deep on the alphabet here.
I use the dash sometimes and not other times just to keep people on their toes. I don't like to be consistent.
That is what we like to hear from our policy experts.
All right, we've got 69% of you, 73%, and there is a strong preference for the all of the above option there. So I think we can probably go ahead and call this one. There were no answers for any of the other choices, and let's see how that shakes out. That is, of course, correct. As we talked about before, all of these must be in the written policies and procedures. We also discussed if you adopt the checklists that California HCD has put out there, you will automatically be in compliance with most of these things. So again, strong plug for that checklist. Or it's not the checklist, it's a form with your comparable units and your participant unit all right there in columns in front of you. Please adopt that form. It's very helpful. All right, back to you, Gordon.
All right, thank you. Question 10, which of the following should not be excluded when calculating rent reasonableness and utility assistance, which should not be excluded? Is it A, pet rent, rent for pets, B, internet, C, phone service, D, occupancy fees, or E, they should all be included? Which of these should not be excluded when calculating rent reasonableness and utility limits? Well, that looks like occupancy fees with 88% and counting. So let's go ahead and see if occupancy fees should not be excluded when calculating rent reasonableness. It is, of course, occupancy fees. I was hoping more people would answer pet rent. We only got one pet rent bite. Rent for pets. What a concept. Next slide, please. Over to you, Mike.
All right, that brings us to the end of our presentation. So I will go ahead and take the slides down, and then we can handle any questions that have come in through the chat, and we can open it up for you to ask any other questions that you would like. Let me go ahead and get this down.
Thanks, Michael Thomas. Appreciate that. And Gordon, great presentation. We do have a question from Lauren. And Lauren, please, if you want to ask your question, you may do so. I will do so in your absence. So all of the information that used to be on it, and it, I believe, is the rent reasonableness check form, is no longer necessary. Like questions that ask about the parking, the drapes, the carpet, the storage, etc. So Gordon, you said we would answer this during Q&A. We have arrived.
I really put my neck out there, didn't I? I don't want to speak to whether it was ever necessary. I want to talk about what is necessary now. The full list of what you must include is encapsulated in the rent reasonableness policy. If it's not in that policy, and if it hasn't been added by the subrecipient as part of a written policy downstream, then it doesn't need to be included. That includes parking your drapes, storing your carpets, whatever you want to put on there. If it's not in the HCD rent reasonableness policy or a subrecipient policy that supplements it, or in your project policies or procedures, or if it's not in a policy somewhere that says you got to do it, then you don't have to do it.
Thank you, Gordon. And looks like Lauren said thank you as well. And to be clear, I think before we arrived and created the rent reasonableness checklist, I don't believe HCD had a checklist that they were necessarily supporting, because we didn't find anything in writing. So this is, you might have had something, Lauren, in your community you had created, but HCD, I don't believe, had anything for you to work off of. Mike, anything to add to that? I don't think so, but I want to give you a shot.
No.
I see no more questions in the chat, so it's the time where we can sit in quiet silence. The slides will be sent out afterwards, Richmond, and we'll send out the recording as well. You will also get a listserv message in the next couple of days that has all 16 new and non-traditional training sessions in it that you can go back and review at your leisure.
Nobody has a deep burning rent reasonableness question?
I have a question. So Gordon, you kind of said a little something that we saw today. What are the other things that we've seen in monitoring around rent reasonableness that have been vexing to us? I think you had mentioned filling out the entire form as one of those things. Have we seen any other common errors that our monitors have kind of shared with us?
Yeah, the other one that I've heard about is lack of comparable unit backup documentation. So we'll see like a beautifully filled out form and absolutely no idea where any of that information came from. Clearly it came from like rent.com or somewhere, but there's no evidence of that. There's no printout, there's no snapshot of the sign, there's none of that. And so making sure that you document where the information is coming from is just as important as getting your map on the form correct. That's the other big thing that I've heard. Mike, anything that you have heard that you would put on the table there?
Not that I've heard specifically. Yeah, I don't know that I have anything I've heard specifically that I can add. I do think the backup documentation is important, though, and would note that if you include in your policy where you're going to pull that information from, it makes the backup documentation piece quite a bit easier, because it will be right there in your policy. And when the monitor reads it, they will know where you're getting that information.
Good tip. Thanks. The other tip that came up in this, and I don't think we were talking about this earlier on, but I know in the last few rent reasonableness sessions we've done, is the idea of that rent reasonableness binder. I had never, as being a person who hasn't been in the field since rent reasonableness exists, didn't ever think about that, Gordon. So that was something that I know I picked up from the trainings as a good tip.
Cool. It's one of Mike Thomas's very favorite things to ride in on with the road reasonableness finder. So I'm glad we could bring that to you. I see a question in the chat. I'm going to kick it over to Irma would like to know if I need to do a rent reasonableness assessment for a studio unit and I can't find another studio unit in the area, what do I do?
Well, I think the first place I would go would be, it's actually a question back to you, which would be, what have you done to try and find it? Not because I think you have not done the work to try and find it, but I would be curious if you've used any of those resources that we mentioned today, like, if you have access to a real estate agent or anything like that. They can often help with that. I would ask if there is a PHA in the area that you might be able to reach out to. They often will have figures around things like that. So just kind of exploring. I would want to explore what resources you've already looked into. And then if you have exhausted all of your resources, you can reach out to HCD, because also remember, there is an option to get a waiver from them if it is just impossible to find comps for what you were trying to find a comp for, and you can talk about potential solutions to that, whether it be looking in a larger geographic area, or doing some kind of adjustment for, like, say, 1 bedrooms and adjusting that down to what a reasonable rent for a studio could be. Because remember, rent reasonableness is flexible, and as long as you're documenting what you're doing and it is sound, then it's probably going to be okay. So that would be my first thing. I would say, really dig into the resources that you've utilized. I'm leaning on the PHA one heavily there if you have access to one, because I feel like in this situation that can be a good one. And in California now, there's some things going on with rent that, we're seeing more like hotel rooms that have been converted into units and things like that. And so it is kind of tricky figuring out what a comparable is for units sometimes. So I just want to acknowledge that. But yeah, I would want to dig into those resources and figure out if there's some maybe more non-traditional ones or ones you haven't thought of. And then from there would probably, if that doesn't fix the problem, reach out to HCD and talk about what the best path forward is.
Yeah, you actually stole my hot take for California, which is we do have this thing called Project Home Key. Those units might be assisted, they might not. That's the only tricky part, is Home Key is so flexible, you could have built it any way you wanted. So it may bring assets to your community, it may all be assisted, it might not help you at all. But that is very much looking at that studio single room occupancy model. We used to see this a lot 10 years ago. We're seeing a resurgence in it, it seems, a little bit post-COVID. So yeah, that was gonna be my hot take. Gordon, any takes for you?
There's a lot of places you can find units, and you would be surprised at how often you can find information just driving down the street and taking pictures of signs.
Thank you, Gordon. Angel, I see you at the top of the screen. Are you wanting to ask a question, or did my screen just make a weird change here?
It must have just made a weird change.
Okay.
Thanks, though.
No worries. All right, I am not seeing any more questions. Gordon, Mike, any wrap up thoughts for y'all?
Nope. I think I just want to say I know that we are coming to the end of our new and non-traditional series. And Chris, I know you're going to give us an outro on this, but I want to say, at least for my part, it's been a privilege presenting this content. I know I have grown as a presenter, both because of your feedback and because of this opportunity to hone the skill of transmitting information on this medium to y'all. My presentations everywhere are better for it. And in as much as you have learned from us, we have certainly learned from you and from this format. I appreciate very much the opportunity. Thank you all.
Yeah, without repeating it, I would just echo the same thing. It has been a pleasure. Really enjoyed spending this time with you. It has been a great opportunity. So thank you.
Thank you, Mike, and thank you, Gordon. And thank you, Kim, in the background, for keeping everything going today. And thank you all for attending this California Housing and Community Development Community Workshops offered through the Emergency Solutions Grant Coronavirus Relief Consulting and Staffing Services contract. This concludes the new and non-traditional provider workshop series. However, a survey is going to come up at the end of this to provide your feedback. We do have other training series still going, so if you have other ideas or other topics you'd like us to train upon, please do that. And with that, it has been a pleasure in the new and non-traditional space with y'all. Have a good rest of your day.